Welcome to the Happier Lives Institute's Wellbeing course. In this course, we are going to cover why measuring well-being is important, the history of well-being, how we measure it and what the well-be is, whether we can trust measures of well-being, some common questions we often get about well-being, how we translate well-being data into cost-effectiveness, and finally, practical tips for implementing well-being data collection. Welcome back to video 3 in our Wellbeing course. In this video, we are going to talk about the reliability, the trustworthiness of subjective data. Can we use it? Can we rely on it? Can we rely on subjective wellbeing measures? Aren't they too subjective? When it comes to making decisions in life, we often use hard data, hard numbers, income, life expectancy, years of education, objective stuff. But happiness, isn't that just a feeling? Feelings change, they're messy. How can we trust a number that's based on how people feel? Well, you probably do that all of the time without recognizing that. So imagine things like movies or Amazon reviews. No scientific formula decides if a movie is good. We just ask people, how much did you like it? And when people answer, clear patterns emerge. So The Godfather, 9.2 out of 10, is a masterpiece.
I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse.
Whereas Sharknado, 3.3, is a disaster, both literally and figuratively. Product ratings work the same way. A 4.9 star review from 10,000 reviews really makes us trust a product. A 1-star rating makes us avoid it. So we use subjective data in consumer decisions. Do we use it in more high-stakes decisions as well? Well, one field which is pretty high stakes would be medicine. But when you go to hospital, if you're in a bit of a pickle, what's one of the questions you might get asked? They might ask you, on a 1 to 10 scale, how bad is your pain? Now, there's no thermometer for pain. Your 7 might be the same as someone else's 4. But doctors trust pain scale because they give useful information. We don't say, pain is subjective, you can't measure that. The point is that it's subjective, it's a feeling, and we accept that people can feel more or less pain, and we want to know how much they are suffering. And it's not just medicine where we use subjective data. Billion-dollar companies will track customer experience through Net Promoter Scores, NPS, using a single question: how likely are you to recommend this? Over 2/3 of Fortune 1000 companies use this to track customer loyalty. So if we use subjective data to guide decisions in business, medicine, movie choices, why not when we're trying to make a difference? So researchers don't just assume that their measure is valid, where valid means that it measures what it is supposed to measure. So to give you a silly example, suppose we're using bathroom scales to measure things. Now, those will be a valid measure of your weight, assuming they're working, but they won't be a valid measure of your happiness. I mean, kind of obviously. There's probably some relationship between your weight and your happiness, but you couldn't claim that the bathroom scales are actually measuring your happiness. It's not a valid measure of happiness, it's a valid measure of weight. So how would we know if a measure of something is trustworthy? In the philosophy of science, this is known as construct validation. And the basic idea is that you test if the measure is behaving in the way you would expect it to if it was really working. So if your bathroom scales, if you step on them, and then you pick up a big rock, the numbers should go higher. So it's working the way you'd expect. For well-being measures, researchers find that these correlate with, again, the sort of things we would expect. So people who are higher in happiness and life satisfaction tend to be richer, healthier, they tend to be in relationships, tend to be employed, they tend to be employed in good jobs, they're less likely to commit suicide, and so on. So to see why this matters, consider it the other way around. If we think that richer people will be happier, but we found that richer people scored worse on our measure of happiness, we'd actually think the measure didn't work and we'd want to go back to the drawing board. So it turns out that asking people the question, how happy are you, is actually a pretty good way to find out how happy they are. Surprising. You might worry that people will deliberately misreport how they feel. This one comes up quite a lot, and of course they could, but why would they? People will misreport only if there's an incentive. So you think about it with pain scales. Patients might exaggerate to get faster treatment, but at the same time, people don't want to deceive their doctors and get the wrong treatment. So the solution to this misreporting is pretty simple. You just remove the incentive to lie. You promise anonymity and that reported scores won't affect the treatment. In other words, just because a measure can be misreported, it doesn't mean we should throw it out completely. I mean, if we did that, we'd have to get rid of nearly everything. Information on company profits, GDP, life expectancy, these could all get misreported. So instead, what we need to look at is designing better surveys, minimizing incentives to misreport, and then you analyze the results carefully for worries about fraud. So the solution isn't to stop measuring, it's to measure better. So do people use happiness scales differently? Here's an example. You've got a Frenchman and an American. The American says they are 7 out of 10, and the Frenchman says they are 6 out of 10. Is the American happier, or are they just more optimistic and using their survey in a different way? How serious is this worry? Ultimately, we think it's worth worrying about, but it's not, in fact, very serious. So if you look at life satisfaction scores from around the world, put them on a map, you'll see that the Nordic countries are at the top with scores around 7 out of 10, places like Finland, Denmark. These are safe, well-run, high-trust societies. And at the bottom of the ranking, you find places like Afghanistan or Iraq with scores around 2 or 3 out of 10. These are dangerous, war-torn, unstable places. And then, of course, the rest of the countries of the world are spread between them. So again, to see why this is reassuring, think about it the other way around. If the Afghans reported 9 out of 10 and the Finns reported 2 out of 10, we'd be really worried the people were using different scales and we wouldn't want to trust it. But as it happens, it looks like approximately everyone is using the same sorts of scales in comparison. Another thing we can look at is migration. So if happiness was just about how people interpret the scale, we'd expect migrants to keep their old country's happiness levels even after moving somewhere new. But actually they don't. A study from 2018 found that within a couple of years of migrating, non-refugee migrants had assimilated to about 75% of the average life satisfaction of their new country. This suggests that happiness scores reflect real differences in quality of life, not just reporting styles. Also, it's usually a comparison over time in a given country is the thing we're interested in. So even if cultural baselines differ, we can still see how things change over time. And it's safe, or at least safer, to assume that people who are part of the same linguistic group, who share the same life experiences, used to talking to each other, will use scales in a similar way. After all, self-reported scales are just an extension of our normal verbal communication. Another question is whether people use happiness scales in a linear way. Okay, so imagine 2 countries. In country A, each step on the scale represents an equal jump in happiness. So moving from a 1 to a 2 feels the same as moving from a 9 to a 10. So people in country A would use a linear scale, just like you would use a classroom ruler with even spaces. But in country B, the top of the scale is compressed. So it takes a much bigger move to go from a 9 to a 10 than from a 1 to a 2. So the people in country B would be using a non-linear scale. How worried should we be about this? Again, we think it's not a big worry, and there are 3 reasons to indicate that people do in fact use a roughly linear scale. So one reason is that most people say they use a linear scale. We ran a pilot study in 2023 when we simply asked people, and they said that this was how they use the scale, giving them different options to choose between. However, just because people say that, it doesn't mean this is what really happens, so we need to look at the other evidence. Another piece of evidence is that people spread out verbal labels on a numerical scale. So when people are asked to assign numerical labels to categories like very happy, somewhat happy, and to put them with numbers, they tend to space them out roughly equidistantly on the numerical scale. And this suggests that people interpret subjective scales as linear when you give them an option. And finally, Nobel-winning game theorist Thomas Schelling ran a famous experiment in the 1950s. He asked students, if you are to meet a stranger in New York, but you cannot communicate with the person, then where and when will you choose to meet? You've got to guess. And amazingly, most people independently choose the same place and time, noon at Grand Central Terminal. Not because there was a correct answer, but because when we can't communicate explicitly with others, we use predictable solutions, what we think other people will do. And so for just the same way, we expect people to instinctively use well-being scales in the most straightforward way possible, where each space conveys the same difference in meaning, and then the top and bottom are the most and least of whatever's being measured. So in this video, you should have learned that we also rely on subjective data in many aspects of our lives. There are good reasons to think that asking people, how happy are you, is a pretty good way to find out how happy they are. And researchers don't just assume this, they test it. It's possible that people use happiness scales in a different way, so the French person might have 8 of 10 mean something different from the American, but we think these differences are probably too small to be a serious worry. And there's also evidence that people use the scale in a linear way, and we've said why it makes sense that they would do that, because that's the simplest way to communicate. So in conclusion, we've seen that although well-being data isn't perfect, it is much better than you might have expected. And the question we really need to be asking is not, is subjective well-being perfect, but is it better than the alternatives? And we think it is, because it allows us to get to what really matters in people's own lives, as they can tell us themselves.